This is a private, members-only community event, and you and your associates are in violation of Serenity Meadows Estates bylaws, Section 9, subsection C, regarding unauthorized gatherings on common property. I'm giving you 10 minutes to disperse before I have the sheriff's department remove you for trespassing. The voice was as sharp and unpleasant as gravel in a shoe, and it belonged to a woman who looked like she'd been poured into a pastel pink tracksuit and had set about 5 minutes ago. She stood, hands on her hips, her golf cart parked belligerently on the edge of the clearing, its tires crushing a patch of wild daisies. Her name was Karen Miller, the self-appointed queen of the Beige Palace HOA next door, and she was standing about a quarter-mile deep into my 150-acre property. My property. I took a slow sip of my beer, the setting sun warming the back of my neck, and looked around at my associates. There was Sergeant Marcus Thorne, a double amputee who could still outfish anyone I knew, currently teaching my 10-year-old son Leo how to properly bait a hook. There was Specialist Maria Flores, a former combat medic who now ran a nonprofit for equine therapy, laughing as she stoked the massive bonfire we'd built in the stone-lined fire pit my father and I had constructed 30 years ago. In total, there were about 15 of us, veterans from my old unit and our families, here for the second annual Task Force Resilience Retreat. It was a weekend of peace, camaraderie, and quiet healing on land that had been in my family for 3 generations. Karen's presence was a violation far deeper than any bylaw she could invent. I set my beer down on the worn wooden picnic table. "Ma'am," I said, my voice deliberately calm, the way my CO taught me to sound when things were about to get very loud. "First, this isn't an unauthorized gathering. This is a private barbecue on private land. Second, this isn't HOA common property. This is my farm. You drove past 3 no trespassing signs to get here, so I'd ask you to get back in your little cart and leave." She scoffed, a sound like air leaking from a tire. "I am the president of the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association. I know exactly where the property lines are. This entire undeveloped area is a designated green space for the enjoyment of our residents, not a campground for vagrants." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Marcus, from his wheelchair by the pond, went still. Maria's laughter died. Even my son, Leo, looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. That was it. The switch flipped. "Ma'am, you have 30 seconds to leave my property before I call the sheriff myself." Her face flushed a shade of magenta that clashed violently with her tracksuit. "I've already called him," she shrieked, pulling a rhinestone-covered phone from her pocket and waving it like a scepter. "He's on his way to deal with you people." Well, at least she saved me the trouble. Now we wait. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board member who thinks their little rule book is the law of the land, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to hear your HOA nightmare stories because I have a feeling this one is just getting started, and we're all going to need the support. 20 minutes later, the distant crunch of tires on my gravel driveway announced the arrival of law enforcement. A single patrol car from the county sheriff's department rolled to a stop next to Karen's golf cart. The man who stepped out was Sheriff Brody, a tall, weathered guy with a face that looked like it had been carved from local oak. He'd known my father, and I'd known him since I was a kid stealing apples from Old Man Hemlock's orchard. He took in the scene. The bonfire, the families fishing, the tents set up near the tree line, and then his eyes landed on Karen, who was practically vibrating with self-righteous indignation. "Evening, Jack," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Ma'am," Karen launched into her tirade. "Sheriff, thank goodness you're here. This man," she said, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me, "is holding an illegal encampment on HOA property. They're a public nuisance, a safety hazard, and they refuse to leave. I want them all cited for trespassing." Brody listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When she finally wound down, he turned to me. "Jack, what's your side of it?" I didn't even look at Karen. I looked at the sheriff. "Brody, you know my family's owned this land since my granddad bought it in '46. You know where the lines are. This woman drove her golf cart half a mile onto my land, past posted signs to harass my guests. These are my friends, fellow veterans, and their families. We're having a cookout." Brody nodded slowly. He turned his gaze back to Karen, who was puffing up for another round. "Ma'am," he began, his voice taking on a formal, tired edge. "I'm looking at the county plat map on my dash computer right now. The Serenity Meadows development ends about a half-mile back that way." He gestured with his thumb toward the cookie-cutter mansions, barely visible through the trees. "According to this official survey, your HOA doesn't have any common property or green space over here. This is all part of the 150-acre Callahan farm. You're the one who's currently trespassing." Karen's jaw dropped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the bonfire and the chirping of crickets. Her face went from magenta to a pale, blotchy white. She stared at the sheriff, then at me, then back at the sheriff, her mind clearly unable to process the information. It was as if the world she had constructed, a world where her authority was absolute, had just been declared a fiction by the actual law. That can't be right," she stammered. "The developer told us. The viewscape." Sheriff Brody sighed, the sound of a man who had seen this brand of foolishness 1,000 times. "Ma'am, what a developer promises on a sales brochure and what's filed with the county clerk are two different things. Jack here owns this land free and clear, which means you are on his property without his permission after being asked to leave." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he delivered the final beautiful blow. "So, Jack," he said, turning back to me, his eyes glinting with a hint of dark amusement, "do you want to press charges?" The question hung in the air, a beautiful, perfect trap. I looked at Karen, whose face was a mask of utter disbelief and horror. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. She, the great enforcer of rules, was now the rule breaker, the trespasser, the one at the mercy of the very person she had tried to humiliate. A part of me, the part that had seen her insult my friends and try to ruin a sacred space, wanted to say yes. I wanted to see her processed, cited, and forced to answer for her arrogance in a formal setting. But I was a strategist, not just a soldier. A public citation would be a small victory, a skirmish. I was already thinking about the war. This was her first major mistake, a public and legally witnessed overreach. It was a data point, the cornerstone of a foundation I might need to build later. "No, Sheriff," I said, my voice even. "Not tonight. I think the lady has just had a simple misunderstanding about her new neighborhood." I gave Karen a look that was entirely devoid of warmth. "I'm sure now that you've clarified the legal property lines for her, it won't happen again. Will it, ma'am?" The ma'am was laced with just enough ice to make her flinch. She couldn't speak. She just shook her head, a jerky puppet-like motion. "Good," I said. "Then I'd appreciate it if you'd leave now. My son is trying to learn how to fish." Sheriff Brody gave me a short, sharp nod of understanding. He turned to Karen. "You heard him. Get in your cart and go. And don't let me get called out here for this again." Without another word, she scrambled into her golf cart, fumbling with the keys. She didn't dare look at me or any of my guests as she gunned the electric motor, tearing a messy rut in the soft earth as she sped away into the twilight, a pink blur of retreating humiliation. As the sound of her cart faded, a cheer went up from around the bonfire. Marcus raised his bottle in a toast. "To property lines and common sense," he yelled, and everyone laughed. The tension broke. But I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt a cold knot of certainty in my gut. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. I knew her type. People like Karen Miller don't learn from humility. They fester. Humiliation is not a lesson to them. It's a wound, and they only know how to respond by seeking to wound back harder. My dream for this land was simple. After 15 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, seeing places built up and torn down, I wanted a piece of the world that was just mine, stable, unchanging. When my father passed and left me the farm, it felt like coming home to a place I'd only ever visited. The 150 acres were mostly dense woodland, rolling hills, and a spring-fed pond that was my personal slice of heaven. The old farmhouse was dilapidated, but the barn was solid. I sold my house in the city and moved into a small apartment in the nearby town of Oak Haven, planning to spend the next few years restoring the farmhouse myself, bit by bit. The land wasn't for development. It wasn't an investment to be flipped. It was a legacy, and I wanted to use it for something good. That's where Task Force Resilience came from. During my last tour, I lost two good men, not in combat, but to the quiet war they fought after they came home. The idea of a retreat, a place where vets could decompress, connect with people who understood, and just be in nature without expectation, took root. My farm was the perfect place. Before Serenity Meadows existed, my only neighbors were the Hendersons, an elderly couple with a dairy farm to the west and acres of state forest to the north. Then about 2 years ago, a developer bought the 200-acre parcel to my east. They clear-cut a huge swath of it, leveled the hills, and began putting up massive, identical houses with 3-car garages and perfectly manicured lawns. Serenity Meadows Estates was born. My first interaction with them was a welcome basket left on my gate, filled with artisanal crackers, a bottle of cheap wine, and a glossy brochure. The brochure was filled with pictures of smiling, attractive families jogging on pristine asphalt paths and kayaking on a lake that, I noted with some amusement, was actually my pond, photoshopped to look bigger and bluer. The accompanying letter, signed by the Community Planning Committee, welcomed me to the neighborhood and gently suggested I might consider clearing some of the overgrowth along my eastern fence line to improve the scenic vista for all residents. I threw it away. The first direct contact with Karen came a few months later. A letter, this time on official-looking HOA letterhead, arrived in my P.O. box. It was a notice of violation. Violation of what? I'd muttered, tearing it open. It cited a non-existent bylaw about unmanaged agricultural property and informed me that the presence of my 1978 John Deere tractor, which I kept parked near my barn, was aesthetically displeasing and lowered property values. It demanded I store it out of sight. I wrote back a simple one-sentence letter. Dear Ms. Miller, I am not a member of your HOA, nor is my property subject to its covenants. Please cease all correspondence. I sent it via certified mail. That, I thought, would be the end of it. How wrong I was. The letters kept coming, each more absurd than the last. There was a fine for the unapproved color of my barn's roof, rust. A warning about the excessive noise from my chainsaw when I was clearing fallen trees after a storm. A demand that I submit a landscaping plan for my forest for their approval. Each letter was a pathetic attempt to extend her little kingdom's borders. I ignored them all, creating a file instead, a thick, growing file labeled HOA nonsense. I saw her sometimes when I was working on my fence line, a stout figure in the distance, often peering at my property through binoculars from the deck of her oversized house. She was observing me, studying me, looking for weakness. The confrontation at the bonfire wasn't a random act. It was a calculated escalation, her attempt to move from paper threats to direct physical authority. And when that failed, when the law itself stood with me against her, I knew she wouldn't just retreat. She would regroup, rearm, and come at me from a different direction. As I stood there watching my friends and my son, now blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just over the hill, I felt a familiar sensation from my time in the service, the quiet calm before a planned engagement. I had the high ground. I had the law on my side. But my opponent was irrational, relentless, and obsessed. The most dangerous kind. The war for my peace had just been declared. The week after the bonfire incident was quiet, unnervingly so. No letters, no golf cart incursions, no sign of Karen Miller peering through her binoculars. It was the silence of a predator licking its wounds and planning its next attack. I used the time to fortify my position. My first call was to my old friend Dave Miller, no relation to Karen, thankfully. A guy I'd served with who was now a paralegal specializing in property law. I explained the situation, from the first nonsensical letters to the trespassing confrontation with Sheriff Brody as a witness. Dave listened, letting out a low whistle. Man, you've got a classic grade A Napoleon in a pantsuit on your hands, Jack. This is textbook overreach. The good news is, she's already made a huge unforced error by trespassing and getting called on it by the law. I could hear him typing as we spoke. Okay, first things first. Documentation is your shield and your sword. You've got the file of her letters? That's perfect. From now on, everything gets documented. Every interaction, every phone call, every sighting of her near your property line. Create a log, date, time, what happened, who was there. It feels like overkill now, but if this goes where I think it's going, a detailed log is irrefutable. He was right. In the Army, we lived and died by reports and logs. This was no different, just a different kind of battlefield. My next step was to upgrade my defenses. The no trespassing signs were clearly not enough for someone who believed her authority superseded state law. I ordered a dozen new, larger signs made of heavy-gauge aluminum. They read, "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Trespassing includes, but is not limited to, pedestrian, vehicular, and drone overflight. Surveillance in use." The drone part was a new addition. I'd seen a drone hovering near my pond a few weeks back and had assumed it was just a kid from the neighborhood. Now I wasn't so sure. I spent a Saturday with Leo, driving new posts and mounting the signs every 50 feet along the entire half-mile border I shared with Serenity Meadows. It was a clear, unmistakable message. This is a boundary. Do not cross. Leo, with the black and white morality of a 10-year-old, was furious on my behalf. "Why is she so mean, Dad? This is our land." "Some people, buddy," I explained as I tightened a bolt, "get a little bit of power, and it makes them think they have all the power. They think their rules are the only rules that matter." He looked up at the sign, then at the big houses on the hill. "Well, she's a bully." "Yes, she is," I said, "and we don't let bullies push us around." It was a simple lesson, but it was the core of this whole conflict. A week after the signs went up, the paper war began again, but this time with a new level of fraudulent audacity. A thick manila envelope arrived, not in my P.O. box, but taped directly to the new gate I'd installed at my driveway entrance. It was a final notice of lien intent from the Serenity Meadows Estates HOA. My blood ran cold for a second before I saw the amateurishness of it. The document was a poorly designed word template, filled with quasi-legal jargon. It claimed that due to my persistent failure to comply with community standards and refusal to pay outstanding fines, the HOA was placing a lien on my property for the sum of $7,500. The fines were itemized: $1,000 for unapproved landscaping, wild growth; $500 for improper vehicle storage, tractor; $2,500 for unauthorized commercial activity, veterans retreat; and a whopping $3,500 in legal and administrative fees. It was signed in a large looping script by Karen Miller, president. It was completely, utterly fraudulent. An HOA can only place a lien on a property that is part of the association and bound by its covenants. Trying to lien my farm was like the local garden club trying to fine me for having weeds. It had zero legal standing, but it was designed to do one thing: intimidate. A person who didn't know the law might panic, might think this was real, might even pay it. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was attempted fraud. I scanned the document and emailed it to Dave. His reply came back in less than 10 minutes. "Wow, she is either monumentally stupid or thinks you are. This is a whole new level, Jack. This isn't just a violation letter. It's a fraudulent legal document. This is wire fraud, mail fraud. Hell, it's just plain fraud. We've got her." My instinct was to storm over there, to confront her with this garbage and the legal statutes she was breaking. But Dave's advice was cooler, more strategic. Don't respond to her. Don't acknowledge you even received it. We're going to draft a formal cease and desist letter, but we're not sending it to her. We're going to send it to the entire HOA board of directors, and we're going to send it via a process server. The strategy was brilliant. Karen was acting like a lone dictator. By addressing the entire board, we were forcing them to become aware of her actions and, by extension, her liability. A process server would make it impossible for them to claim they never received it. It was a formal, legal shot across their bow. The letter Dave drafted was a masterpiece of cold, legal precision. It laid out the facts in chronological order. My ownership of the property, the fact that it was not and had never been part of the Serenity Meadows HOA, the initial campaign of harassing letters, the trespassing incident witnessed by Sheriff Brody, and now the fraudulent attempt to place a lien on my property. It cited the specific state statutes Karen was violating, including those for harassment, trespassing, and fraud. It demanded three things. First, an immediate and permanent cessation of all contact from Karen Miller in the HOA. Second, a formal written retraction of the fraudulent lien notice. Third, a written apology from the HOA board for their harassment. It gave them a deadline of 10 business days to comply, after which we would explore all available legal remedies, including but not limited to filing for a restraining order against Ms. Miller and pursuing civil damages for harassment and attempted fraud. The final paragraph was the real stinger. It stated that since Ms. Miller was acting in her capacity as HOA president, the board of directors and the HOA as a whole could be held liable for her actions. This was designed to turn them against her, to make them see her not as their leader, but as a massive financial and legal risk. We found a local process server, a burly ex-cop named Stan, who seemed to relish the job. "Oh yeah, I know that Serenity Meadows place," he grunted. "Real den of vipers, serving papers on their high and mighty board? Be my pleasure." 5 days later, Stan called me. Service complete. Served the treasurer at his home, the secretary at her office, and 2 other board members. Saved the best for last. Served the president, Karen Miller, right in the middle of her weekly bridge game at the community clubhouse. I could hear the grin in his voice. "You've never seen a deck of cards scatter so fast? She turned a color I ain't seen before." The ball was in their court. The 10-day clock was ticking. I knew Karen wouldn't back down, but now she wasn't just fighting me. She was fighting a process server, a paralegal, and the uncomfortable reality that her own board of directors was now legally entangled in her personal vendetta. The paperwork war had escalated, and I had just deployed a weapon she didn't see coming, her own liability. The 10-day deadline passed in absolute silence. No letter of apology, no retraction, nothing. It was a calculated act of defiance, a doubling down that told me Karen had likely either bullied or convinced her board to call our bluff. Or perhaps she simply hadn't told them the full story. People like her are masters of controlling the narrative, and I could easily imagine her framing my cease and desist as an aggressive attack from a hostile neighbor rather than a response to her own illegal actions. Fine. If they wanted to play it that way, it was time to move beyond letters and lawyers. It was time to build alliances. My first stop was the Hendersons' dairy farm. Bill and Mary Henderson were in their late 70s, with hands like gnarled oak and eyes that had seen 70 seasons come and go across these hills. They were fixtures of the county, the kind of people who measured wealth in healthy livestock and good neighbors, not square footage. I found Bill out by his barn, fixing a piece of machinery with a wrench that looked older than I was. "Jack," he said, wiping grease from his hands onto an already black rag. "Good to see you. Heard you had a bit of a run-in with the Queen Bee over at the palace." News traveled fast in the country. "You could say that," I said. "I came to ask if you and Mary have had any trouble with them." Bill let out a short, bitter laugh. "Trouble? That woman, Miller, her name is, sent us a certified letter last spring complaining that the smell of our cows was a noxious olfactory pollutant that violated their air quality standards." Air quality standards. We've been farming this land for 50 years. Where did she think milk comes from, a faucet? Mary came out of the farmhouse carrying a pitcher of lemonade. She was a small bird-like woman with a core of steel. "That's not the half of it, Jack," she said, pouring me a glass. "She tried to get the county to cite us for noise violations because our rooster crows in the morning." The rooster. She told the county inspector it was disturbing her peace and tranquility. The inspector laughed in her face. They had a file too, a folder just like mine, filled with absurd complaints and threatening letters. They had been fighting this battle quietly for 2 years, weathering the storm with the quiet resilience of farmers. They'd felt isolated, like they were the only ones being targeted. Showing them my own file, my cease and desist, the fraudulent lien notice. It was like opening a floodgate. We spent 2 hours at their kitchen table, comparing notes, our separate stacks of paper, merging into a single damning chronicle of Karen Miller's reign of terror. "She's trying to create her own little fiefdom," Bill said, his jaw tight with anger. "She wants all this." He waved a hand toward the window, at the rolling green hills and old-growth forests, "to be nothing but a pretty backdrop for her subdivision. She doesn't want it to be real. She doesn't want it to have tractors or cows or, God forbid, veterans having a barbecue." By the time I left, we had a pact. We would share information, coordinate our responses, and present a united front. I wasn't just fighting for my 150 acres anymore. I was fighting for the Henderson's farm, for the rooster that crows at dawn, for the very character of our rural community. My next move was more subversive. I needed a source inside Serenity Meadows. Dave's legal strategy had targeted the board, but I suspected Karen controlled the flow of information. I needed to know what was really being said in their meetings, what their next move was. I thought back to the bonfire. When Sheriff Brody had laid down the law, I'd scanned the faces of the onlookers who had gathered on the edge of the HOA property, drawn by the commotion. Most were just curious, but I'd seen one man, standing at the back, who had a small, almost imperceptible nod of satisfaction when Karen was dressed down. He was in his late 60s, with a military-style haircut, a vet. I found the HOA directory online. It was publicly available, a testament to their desire for perceived transparency. I looked for names that I could cross-reference with local VFW or American Legion rosters. It took a few hours, but I found him. Colonel Robert Fletcher, USAF, retired. He lived 3 doors down from Karen. I decided on a direct approach. I drove to the entrance of Serenity Meadows. I wasn't about to trespass myself, and called him from the directory keypad at the gate. "Colonel Fletcher, my name is Jack Callahan. I'm a retired Army major. I own the property adjacent to your development. I'm hoping I could have a few minutes of your time." There was a pause. "The fellow with the bonfire?" he asked, his voice a crisp baritone. "The same. Gates opening. My house is the fourth on the right. Blue shutters. And for God's sake, park in the driveway. Karen will have a conniption if your tires touch the grass." Colonel Fletcher's home was as immaculate as the rest of the neighborhood on the outside, but inside it was a different world. The walls were covered in aviation prints, commendations, and photos of him standing next to various fighter jets. He was a man who, like me, had lived a life of structure and purpose before retiring to this sea of beige. He poured us both a coffee. "I've been waiting for your call, Major," he said, getting straight to the point. "What that woman did at your property was a disgrace, an embarrassment to this entire community." He confirmed my suspicions. Karen ran the HOA board like a dictator. The other members were either too intimidated to stand up to her or were part of her inner circle of gossips and sycophants. When my cease and desist arrived, she'd spun it as a declaration of war from an uncooperative and dangerous neighbor. She'd claimed I was threatening to sue them all into bankruptcy. She conveniently left out the part about her trespassing and trying to file a fraudulent lien, I said. Fletcher nodded grimly. Of course she did. Karen's truth is whatever serves Karen's interests. Most of the people here just want to live their lives. They pay their dues, they follow the rules, and they don't want to make waves. But she's created a climate of fear. People are afraid to speak out against her, afraid their own property will be targeted for violations if they do. He leaned forward. I'm sick of it. I didn't spend 30 years defending this country to come home and be dictated to by a petty tyrant in a golf cart. You have an ally, Major. What do you need? It was a turning point. I now had eyes and ears on the inside. Fletcher agreed to be my source, to let me know what was being planned in the secret board meetings, to gauge the mood of the residents. He was the insurgency. The information he provided over the next few weeks was invaluable. He told me that Karen, furious at my cease and desist, was now trying to rally the board to hire a high-powered law firm to put me in my place. She was using HOA funds to fight her personal war. He also told me that my new signs, particularly the part about drone surveillance, had hit a nerve. Apparently, Karen's husband was an avid drone hobbyist. Suddenly, the mysterious drone I'd seen over my pond made a lot more sense. With Fletcher's intel, Bill and Mary Henderson's alliance, and Dave's legal guidance, My support network was solidifying. It was a multi-front operation. We had the legal front, the community front, and now the intelligence front. Karen thought she was isolating me. In reality, her own aggression was uniting a coalition against her. She was so focused on me, the external enemy, that she never imagined the rebellion would start from within her own perfect, manicured kingdom. The calm was shattered on a Tuesday morning. I was down by the pond checking the water level when I noticed something wrong with the line of ancient pine trees that separated my property from the manicured lawns of Serenity Meadows. The needles on the lower branches of a dozen trees, all on my side of the fence, were turning a sickly, chemical brown. It wasn't a natural blight. It was a perfect, straight line of death, about 3 feet high, stretching for 100 yards. It looked exactly like it had been sprayed. A cold, hard anger settled in my chest. This wasn't a letter. This wasn't a verbal threat. This was sabotage. This was the deliberate destruction of my property. My mind immediately went to Karen. This had her fingerprints all over it. It was vindictive, cowardly, and designed to inflict damage while maintaining a thin veneer of deniability. Who could prove where a chemical spray came from? I documented everything. I took hundreds of photos from every conceivable angle, showing the dead branches, the clear line of the spray, and its relation to the property line and the fence. I took close-ups of the shriveled, brown needles. I took soil samples from the base of the affected trees and from a control area 50 feet away. I called a certified arborist I knew from town, a man named George, and asked him to come out and do a formal assessment. George arrived that afternoon. He was a quiet, methodical man who loved trees more than most people. He walked the line of pines, his face growing grimmer with each step. "This is no disease, Jack," he said, crushing a handful of dead needles in his hand. They crumbled into dust. "This is a powerful, non-selective herbicide, glyphosate most likely, but a high concentration, sprayed directly onto the foliage. This is deliberate, malicious." He looked at the size of the trees, some of which were nearly 100 years old. "These lower branches are gone for good. The trees might survive, but they'll be scarred permanently. And if the dosage was high enough to be absorbed into the root system, you could lose them entirely." The cost to replace a dozen mature pine trees would be astronomical, well into the tens of thousands of dollars. But it wasn't about the money. Those trees were part of the soul of this land. They had been here longer than my family, longer than the state of Serenity Meadows. They were a living wall that provided privacy, blocked the wind, and housed generations of birds and squirrels. To poison them was to poison a piece of my home. This escalation changed the game. Harassment was one thing. Destruction of property was another. The problem was proof. I knew it was Karen, but knowing and proving are two different universes in the eyes of the law. I felt a surge of frustration. How could I fight an enemy who operated in the shadows, who used poison in the dead of night? The answer, I realized, was light. I needed to drag her actions into the light. That evening, I drove into the city and went to a specialty surveillance store. I didn't buy some cheap, off-the-shelf system. I bought a professional-grade multi-camera security system with night vision, motion detection, and high-definition recording. It was an investment, but I was done playing defense. I was going on the offensive. The next 3 days were a blur of activity. I ran conduit, mounted cameras, and networked the whole system to a secure server in my barn. I placed the cameras strategically, concealed in the foliage, on high poles and under the eaves of the barn. I had overlapping fields of fire, covering the entire border with Serenity Meadows, my driveway, the barn, and the pond. No blind spots. The system was motion activated and would send a real-time alert to my phone if it detected any movement in the designated zones. I was setting a trap. I finished the installation on a Friday evening. I sat in my small apartment, watching the live feeds on my laptop. It was like a command center. I could see every corner of my property, clear as day, even in the pitch black of the country night, rendered in the ghostly green of the infrared. I felt a grim satisfaction. Let her try something now. I didn't have to wait long. The first alert came just 2 nights later, at 2:17 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Motion detected. Zone 4. the eastern fence line. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard to pull up the feed from camera 7, the one I'd hidden inside a hollowed-out birdhouse near the poison pines. The infrared image was grainy but clear. A figure dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled low was creeping along my side of the fence. They were carrying something, a backpack sprayer, the kind used for herbicides. The figure stopped, looked around furtively, and began to raise the nozzle of the sprayer towards another section of my trees. I hit the record button, my mind racing. I needed a clear shot of their face. "Come on," I muttered to the screen. "Turn around." As if on cue, the figure paused, perhaps hearing a noise in the distance, and turned their head back toward the direction of Serenity Meadows. The hood fell back slightly. The camera's IR illuminator caught the face, and my blood froze. It wasn't Karen. It was her husband, a doughy, balding man I'd seen a few times from a distance. Mr. Miller. He was the one holding the sprayer. He was the one poisoning my trees. But he wasn't alone. Just as he turned back to the trees, a second figure emerged from the shadows. It was Karen. She wasn't dressed for stealth. She was in a gaudy velour tracksuit, a massive flashlight in her hand, which she was carefully pointing at the ground. She was acting as the lookout. She gestured impatiently at her husband, urging him to hurry up. I had them. I had them both, dead to rights on high-definition video. Trespassing, destruction of property, conspiracy. It was all there, recorded and saved to a secure server. I watched them for another minute as the husband sprayed another 20-foot section of my property line, the chemical mist glowing eerily in the infrared light. Then they scurried back across the fence and disappeared into the darkness of their perfectly manicured domain. I didn't call the sheriff. Not yet. A call tonight would result in their arrest, a misdemeanor charge, a slap on the wrist. That wasn't enough. This wasn't just about two trespassers with a bottle of Roundup. This was about a pattern of systematic harassment and abuse of power, orchestrated by the president of a homeowners association. I wasn't just going to cut off the head of the snake. I was going to dismantle the entire nest. I saved the video file, backed it up to 3 separate drives, and sent one to Dave. The subject line of the email was simple: checkmate. The footage of the Millers poisoning my trees was the linchpin, the irrefutable proof that elevated this conflict from a neighborhood squabble to a serious criminal matter. But a direct assault, even with this evidence, felt too simple. It would give Karen a platform to play the victim, to claim she was being targeted, to rally her supporters. My time in the military taught me that you don't just attack the enemy's soldiers. You attack their supply lines, their command structure, their morale. In this case, Karen's power wasn't just her title. It was the perceived authority and financial stability of the HOA itself. That was her supply line, and I was about to cut it. Dave and I spent the next week building our case. The video was the centerpiece, but we buttressed it with everything else: the log of harassment, copies of the fraudulent letters, the bogus lien notice, photos of the initial tree damage, the certified arborist report, and sworn affidavits from both me and the Hendersons detailing Karen's long-standing pattern of abuse. We weren't just building a criminal complaint. We were building a narrative of unchecked power and malicious intent. The strategy Dave devised was brilliant in its subtlety. It was a legal pincer movement. We wouldn't go to the police or the district attorney first. We would go to the money. Every HOA of that size has a directors and officers liability insurance policy, or a D&O policy, Dave explained, his voice alight with strategic fervor. It protects the board members from being personally sued for decisions they make on behalf of the HOA. But these policies have clauses. They don't cover illegal acts, they don't cover malicious damage, and they really don't like it when their insured clients are engaged in behavior that opens them up to massive lawsuits. Our target was not Karen. It was the insurance company that underwrote the Serenity Meadows HOA. We drafted a formal demand letter, but this one was far more potent than the last. It wasn't addressed to the board. It was addressed to the senior vice president of claims at the insurance company's corporate headquarters, with a carbon copy sent to the HOA board. The letter was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. It began by stating the facts: We represented the owner of the adjacent 150-acre property. It then laid out in excruciating detail the campaign of harassment orchestrated by the HOA's president, Karen Miller. It included exhibits, the letters, the photos, the arborist's report, and then the kill shot. The letter stated that we were in possession of irrefutable, time-stamped video evidence of the HOA president and her spouse trespassing onto our client's property in the middle of the night and deliberately applying a powerful herbicide, causing significant and costly damage to mature trees. It went on to state that these actions constituted multiple criminal offenses, including trespassing, vandalism, and conspiracy, and that these were not the actions of a rogue individual, but a pattern of behavior conducted under the color of her authority as HOA president. The letter did not demand a specific dollar amount. Instead, it did something far more terrifying for an insurance company. It put them on notice of a forthcoming claim for damages that would include not only the full cost of tree replacement, estimated by the arborist at over $50,000, but also punitive damages for the malicious nature of the acts, legal fees, and the cost of installing the security system. The final paragraph was the dagger. It calmly stated that since the HOA board had been previously notified of Ms. Miller's behavior via our first cease and desist letter and had chosen to do nothing, they were now complicit. The insurance company could, and likely would, view this as a failure of governance, potentially voiding their coverage for this incident and dramatically increasing their future premiums, or even dropping them entirely. We sent the package via FedEx, with signature required. The clock started ticking again, but this time it wasn't my clock. It was the insurance company's. They were now losing money every day they didn't deal with this. The reaction was almost instantaneous. 2 days after the package was delivered, I got a call from Colonel Fletcher. His voice was a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. "Jack, all hell has broken loose over here. An emergency board meeting was called last night. I've never seen our treasurer, a milky toast accountant named Jerry, look so pale. Apparently, they got a letter from the insurance company. They're launching a full investigation into Karen's conduct. An adjuster and a legal team are coming down from corporate next week." Karen, according to Fletcher, had tried to control the meeting, to brandish the letter as another attack. But this time, it didn't work. The threat was no longer an angry neighbor. It was the multi-billion-dollar corporation that held their financial lives in its hands. The other board members were terrified. The facade of Karen's absolute power had cracked. Fletcher told me the best part. The insurance company had explicitly forbidden Karen and the board from having any contact with me whatsoever. They had been legally muzzled. A week later, a sleek black sedan with corporate plates rolled up my driveway. 2 people got out. A man in a crisp suit named Mr. Davies, an adjuster, and a woman who introduced herself as Ms. Albright from the insurer's legal department. They were polite, professional, and radiated an aura of people who were not here to play games. I invited them to my barn, where I had a large table set up. I walked them through the evidence piece by piece. I played the video of the Millers on a large monitor. Davies watched it once, then asked me to play it again, his face a stony mask. Albright didn't watch the screen. She watched me, gauging my credibility. When the video finished the second time, Davies took a deep breath. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice flat, "we take matters like this very seriously. Our clients are expected to operate within the bounds of the law. Malicious destruction of property is, needless to say, not covered under their policy." He then asked to see the damage. We walked the fence line together. He took his own photos, his own measurements. He looked at the 100-year-old trees, their lower limbs withered and brown, and shook his head. "This is appalling," he said, and it was the first crack I'd seen in his professional veneer. We walked back to the barn. "What do you want, Mr. Callahan?" Albright asked, getting straight to the point. This was the moment. I could have demanded a huge payout. I could have pushed for criminal charges right then and there. But my goal was never just money or even revenge. It was peace. It was a permanent end to this conflict. "I want 3 things," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "First, I want full restitution for the damages. That includes the removal of the dead branches, treatment for the surviving trees by a certified arborist of my choosing, and the planting of a new row of mature native trees to restore my privacy screen." And I want the HOA's landscaping company, the one I believe supplied the herbicide, to have its contract terminated. Davies nodded. Reasonable. Second, I continued, I want a legally binding injunction filed with the county court and paid for by the HOA that permanently bars Karen Miller, her husband, and any agent of the HOA from ever setting foot on my property, communicating with me or my family in any way, or otherwise interfering with the quiet enjoyment of my land. A lifetime restraining order, essentially. Albright raised an eyebrow, but she didn't object. And third, she asked? Third, I said, leaning forward, I want Karen Miller removed from the HOA board. Her conduct has proven she is unfit to hold a position of authority. She is a liability to you, and she is a menace to this community. I don't care how you do it, but my willingness to settle this civilly without involving the district attorney and the negative publicity that would bring to Serenity Meadows is contingent on her removal. The trap was set. I had offered them a way out, a way to avoid a public criminal trial that would decimate their client's reputation and property values. The price was Karen. They were now incentivized to do my work for me, to cut out the cancer that was rotting their own organization from the inside. Albright and Davies exchanged a long, silent look. The decision had been made. Mr. Callahan, Albright said, her voice crisp and final, I believe we can come to an agreement. The insurance company moved with the ruthless efficiency of a predator that senses a wounded target. They didn't just want to settle my claim, they wanted to cauterize the wound of Karen Miller's liability to prevent any future bleeding. They put immense, unrelenting pressure on the Serenity Meadows HOA board. According to Colonel Fletcher's reports from the inside, the board meetings became scenes of panic and recrimination. The treasurer, Jerry, presented a stark financial picture. If the insurance company dropped them, no other carrier would pick them up with an active lawsuit and a history of malicious conduct. The residents would be personally liable for any future incidents. Property values, the very thing Karen claimed to be protecting, would plummet. Her power base, built on fear and the illusion of protecting their investments, crumbled overnight. Karen, however, was not one to go down without a fight. Cornered and facing the loss of her petty kingdom, she made one last desperate gambit. She called for an emergency, all-hands community meeting in the Serenity Meadows clubhouse. Her goal, as Fletcher explained it to me, was to bypass the board and appeal directly to the residents. She would spin a tale of a hostile, litigious neighbor, me, trying to extort the community, and of an overzealous insurance company trying to bully them. She would paint herself as the brave warrior defending their way of life against outside forces. She was going to try and start a populist uprising to save her own skin. The meeting is Thursday night at 7 p.m., Fletcher told me over the phone. It's supposed to be for residents only. She's going to control the microphone and the narrative. You won't be able to get a word in. I don't need to get a word in, I said, a plan already forming in my mind. I just need to be there, and I'm not coming alone. Thursday night arrived, cool and clear. The Serenity Meadows clubhouse was ablaze with lights, the parking lot filled with luxury SUVs and sedans. Karen was expecting a room full of her subjects, ready to be whipped into a frenzy of indignation. She was not expecting what came next. At 7:05 p.m., just as she was likely taking the podium, a small convoy rolled up to the clubhouse. My dusty but clean Ford F-150 was in the lead. Behind me was Bill Henderson's farm truck, and behind him were 3 more vehicles carrying Marcus Thorne, Maria Flores, and 5 other veterans from our Task Force Resilience retreat. We were all dressed respectfully. I was in a collared shirt, Bill in his Sunday best, my fellow vets in clean, casual clothes. Marcus was in his wheelchair, his jaw set with determination. We were not an invading army. We were a delegation of the community she had wronged. We parked and moved toward the entrance. A flustered-looking board member, a crony of Karen's, tried to block the door. I'm sorry, this is a private meeting for residents only. I looked him calmly in the eye. We are invited guests, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. I didn't specify who had invited us. I let him assume one of his own had. Before he could protest further, Colonel Fletcher appeared at the door. They're with me, he said, his voice ringing with military authority. The board member, outranked and confused, stepped aside. We entered the room. The effect was electric. The room was packed, maybe 200 people, all facing the podium where Karen stood, mid-sentence. She froze, her mouth agape. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. This was her sanitized sanctuary, and it had just been breached by the very people she had demonized. She saw me. She saw the old farmer, Bill Henderson, whose family had been there for generations. She saw Marcus in his wheelchair, a visible testament to the sacrifices she had so casually dismissed. The narrative she had so carefully constructed was already starting to unravel before she'd even spoken a full paragraph. "What is the meaning of this?" she sputtered, her voice trembling with rage. "This is a private meeting. Security, remove these people." A single doughy security guard looked from her to us, then at Colonel Fletcher, and wisely decided to stay put. Fletcher's voice boomed from the back of the room. "They are here at my invitation, Karen. This community has been hearing only one side of a story for weeks. I think it's time they heard the other." Another board member, the treasurer Jerry, who I could now see was sweating profusely under the recessed lighting, stood up. "He's right, Karen. We have to hear them out. There are legal implications." Karen looked at him with pure venom. Her allies were deserting her. I walked slowly and deliberately to the front of the room, not to the podium, but to an open space on the floor. I didn't want to take her stage. I wanted to create my own. I had a file in my hand. "Good evening," I said, my voice calm and clear, easily carrying through the silent room. "My name is Jack Callahan. For those of you who don't know me, I own the 150 acres of land that borders your community to the west." I looked directly at Karen. "Ms. Miller has told you that I am your enemy, that I am trying to extort this community. I am here to tell you the truth." And then I laid it all out. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't use inflammatory language. I just stated the facts one by one, using the evidence from my file. I held up a copy of the fraudulent lien notice. "This is a document Ms. Miller created, attempting to illegally place a lien on my property for $7,500 for violations of rules that do not apply to me." A gasp went through the crowd. "She did this after trespassing on my land to harass my family and my guests," an event witnessed by Sheriff Brody, who informed her she was the one breaking the law. More murmurs. Karen was white as a sheet, gripping the podium. Then I turned to Bill Henderson. "This isn't just about me. Bill, would you mind telling the residents about your experiences?" Bill Henderson, a man who had probably never spoken to a crowd this large in his life, walked forward. In his simple, honest farmer's voice, he told them about the complaints over his cows, the attempts to silence his rooster, the constant harassment aimed at a family who had been part of this land before Serenity Meadows was even a blueprint. The residents were listening intently, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning anger. They weren't looking at me as an enemy anymore. They were looking at Karen. The final piece was the video. I hadn't brought a projector. I didn't need one. I turned to the board. "The insurance company has a copy of a video," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "A video of Miss Miller and her husband on my property at 2 in the morning, destroying my trees with herbicide." The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. "This is the reason your insurance is threatening to drop you. This is the reason you are facing a massive lawsuit. It's not because of me, it's because of her." I pointed directly at Karen, her actions, her lies, her obsession. The room erupted. It wasn't an uprising for Karen. It was an uprising against her. People were shouting, demanding answers from the board. "Is this true, Jerry? Did she really do that? She used our money to do this?" Karen stood frozen for a moment, and then she did the one thing left for a cornered narcissist to do. She snapped. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "It's all lies. He's a monster, a liar trying to ruin our beautiful community. You can't believe him." But no one was listening to her anymore. They were looking at the evidence, at the honest farmer, at the decorated veteran in the wheelchair, and they were looking at her, a shrieking, unhinged figure, and they were finally seeing the truth. The public exposure was complete. Her power was utterly broken, not by a lawsuit, but by the simple, unvarnished truth spoken in a room full of the people she thought she controlled. It was a rout. The aftermath of the community meeting was swift and brutal. Karen Miller's reign didn't just end. It evaporated. The residents, now armed with the truth and facing the very real threat of financial ruin, turned on her with a vengeance. An emergency petition to remove her as president circulated through the neighborhood, gaining the required signatures in less than 24 hours. The board of directors, seeing the writing on the wall and under immense pressure from their insurer, unanimously voted to remove her from her position and censure her for conduct detrimental to the community. Colonel Fletcher called me the next morning. "It's done, Jack," he said, the relief in his voice palpable. "She's out. The board has appointed Jerry as the interim president. His first act was to formally accept all the terms of your settlement agreement. The reversal was total. 2 weeks later, I sat at a long conference table in a sterile downtown law office. On one side was me, Dave, and Bill Henderson, who had asked to be there for moral support. On the other side was Jerry, the new HOA president, two other shaken-looking board members, and Ms. Albright, the lawyer from the insurance company. The atmosphere was somber and businesslike. One by one, the documents were signed. The settlement check covering the full cost of the arborist's work and the new trees was handed to me. It was a substantial sum, far more than I ever wanted, but it represented accountability. Next, Jerry, on behalf of the entire HOA, signed a formal, written apology to me and to the Hendersons for the harassment and damages. Then came the most important document, the permanent injunction, prepared by Dave and reviewed by the insurer's legal team. It was a court order, ready to be filed, that legally barred Karen and her husband from ever setting foot on my property or contacting me again, under penalty of immediate arrest. As Jerry pushed the signed copy across the table to me, he looked me in the eye. His face was pale and he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice quiet but sincere, "on behalf of the residents of Serenity Meadows, the reasonable ones anyway, I am truly sorry for what you and your family have been through. This never should have happened." I simply nodded and accepted the document. The final, symbolic piece of her downfall came a month later. I was out on my property, supervising the crew from the nursery as they planted a row of beautiful, 15-foot-tall white pines along the fence line, creating a new living barrier between my world and theirs. In the distance, I saw a large moving truck pull up to the Miller house. The sight was more satisfying than any financial settlement. Karen, stripped of her power, publicly humiliated, and likely ostracized by the very neighbors she sought to control, was leaving. She couldn't stand to live in the kingdom where she was no longer queen. I watched for a few minutes as the movers began carrying boxes and furniture out of the oversized beige house. I never saw her or her husband. They were scurrying away, retreating from the consequences of their own arrogance. It was a quiet, ignominious end to her tyranny. That afternoon, Colonel Fletcher came by with a bottle of single malt scotch. We sat on my porch watching the new trees sway gently in the breeze. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass, "and to good neighbors." We drank to that. The victory wasn't just mine. It was a victory for the Hendersons, for Colonel Fletcher, for the quiet majority in Serenity Meadows who just wanted to live in peace, and for the principle that a rule book for a subdivision doesn't supersede the fundamental rights of a property owner. It was a moral victory over the abuse of authority. Months passed. The seasons began to turn. The new HOA board, led by Jerry, was quiet and reasonable. They stuck to what they were supposed to do, managing the community pool and making sure people didn't paint their houses purple. They left me and the Hendersons completely alone. The scars on the old pine trees remained, a permanent reminder of the conflict, but new growth was already starting to sprout around the dead branches. My land was healing. The new trees were taking root, their deep green a stark contrast to the perfectly manicured, chemically treated lawns on the other side of the fence. One Saturday in late autumn, I hosted another retreat for Task Force Resilience. The air was crisp, the leaves were a riot of red and gold, and the smell of wood smoke filled the clearing. We had a bigger group this time. Marcus was there, proudly showing off a new prosthetic leg that allowed him to walk short distances. Maria had brought two of her therapy horses, and the sight of these majestic animals grazing peacefully by my pond was something out of a dream. Leo, now an expert at baiting hooks, was teaching a younger kid how to cast. Around dusk, as we were all gathered around the bonfire, sharing stories and laughter, I saw two figures walking tentatively up my driveway. It was Jerry, the new HOA president, and his wife. He was carrying a freshly baked apple pie. I walked over to meet them, a bit wary. "Mr. Callahan, Jack," Jerry said, looking a little nervous. "My wife Sarah made this. We just, we saw you had company, and we wanted to say hello, and to thank you, in a way." I was taken aback. "Thank me for what?" He gestured vaguely back towards his neighborhood. "For helping us get our community back. Things are quieter now. Better. We're neighbors. We thought we should act like it." I looked at the pie, then at his earnest face, and I felt the last bit of tension and anger from the past year finally melt away. "Thank you, Jerry," I said, and I meant it. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people." That evening, the president of the Serenity Meadows HOA sat by a bonfire on my land, sharing a slice of pie with a double amputee sergeant and a combat medic, while our kids roasted marshmallows together. The line between our properties was still there, a clear legal boundary, but the wall of hostility had come down. Justice, I realized, wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about restoring peace. It was about turning a battlefield back into a home. As the stars came out over my 150 acres and the sound of my friends' laughter echoed through the trees, I knew we had finally won. My land was what it was always meant to be. Not a fortress, but a sanctuary.